On a seemingly ordinary day in early March 1983, a group of Scotland Yard's drug squad officers found themselves combing through a sprawling scrapyard in Dalston, an economically disadvantaged area in East London. Their search for illicit substances amid the industrial chaos of steel, vehicles and machinery would inadvertently lay the groundwork for unraveling one of Britain's most audacious heists. The scrapyard, owned by Ronnie Knight, a successful businessman with investments in the leisure sector, was initially suspected of being a front for drug manufacturing. This suspicion brought Jimmy and his brothers, John and Ronnie Knight, under police scrutiny, a scrutiny that would later prove pivotal. The Knight brothers had carved out their distinct paths within the fringes of London's underworld. John, the more reserved of the trio, managed a garage and maintained a semblance of respectability. Ronnie, by contrast, was a flamboyant figure, married to the famous actor Barbara Windsor and owning a nightclub in the West End. Their foray into the criminal world was marked by a blend of legitimate business ventures and illicit operations, a testament to their complex personas. The narrative of the Securities Express robbery began to take shape when John Knight, inspired by the sight of a Security Express van, envisioned executing the perfect crime. This vision led to an elaborate scheme that involved over a year of meticulous planning, reconnaissance and the assembly of a skilled team. Their target was the Security Express depot in Curtain Road, London, identified for its vulnerability during the early morning hours, when a lone guard would momentarily leave his post to fetch a pint of milk. The heist, executed on Easter Monday 1983, was notable for its precision and audacity. The robbers managed to subdue the depot staff, securing over £6 million, a staggering sum that underscores the robbery's scale and sophistication. The investigation into the heist proved challenging, with the flying squad facing dead ends and a lack of substantial leads. The breakthrough came unexpectedly from within the criminal community itself. John Horsley, a man connected to the robbers, and later Alan and Linda Piola, close associates of John Knight, turned informants. Their testimonies proved invaluable insights into the planning and execution of the robbery, exposing the intricate networks and roles individuals played within it. The fallout from the robbery and subsequent investigation was significant. Jimmy Knight faced imprisonment, whilst Ronnie Knight fled to Spain, evading capture for years. The eventual arrest and conviction of Ronnie Knight upon his return to the UK marked the end of a long-standing pursuit by law enforcement. The narrative of the Knights and the Security Express robbery encapsulates themes of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal, intertwined with the personal dramas of those involved. Central to this story is the concept of the perfect crime and its inevitable unraveling. The involvement of informants or supergrasses highlighted the precarious nature of trust within the criminal circles and the lengths to which the law enforcement will go to secure convictions. The discovery of a secret compartment in John Knight's pub, the Fox, and the connections drawn between hidden assets and the robbery's proceeds illustrated the meticulous efforts to conceal the crime's fruits. Beyond the immediate drama and legal repercussions, the Security Express robbery and the Knight brothers saga offer a window into the complexities of criminal enterprises and the challenges of policing such activities. The intertwining of legitimate businesses with illicit operations reflects a strategic approach to crime, blurring the lines between lawful entrepreneurship and outright criminality. The personal dimensions, especially the tale of revenge for David Knight's murder, add layers of motivation and retribution that transcended mere financial gain. This story, rooted in a specific time and place, continues to fascinate and serve as a cautionary tale about the allure of the perfect crime and the inevitable consequences that follow. It underscores the relentless pursuit of justice by law enforcement, the vulnerabilities within criminal networks, and the human stories at the heart of one of Britain's most notorious heists.
It's time now for a specially extended casebook of solved crimes. Tonight we go back 12 years to April 1983, when a gang of armed robbers pulled off the biggest cash robbery in British criminal history. They snatched £6 million in used, untraceable banknotes, which weighed an extraordinary 5 tons. The police operation to bring those believed to be involved in the robbery to justice continues to this day.
Good afternoon, Security Express. How can I help you? All right, he's a bit tied up at the moment. Can I get him to ring you back later on? No problem. Goodbye. One of your customers inquired about the time of a collection tomorrow. I'm sure you'll call him back. Okay, Paddy's the last one's here. Paddy 1 and 3, pick him up at the door. Paddy 4, get the keys.
Where are they? I said, where the fuck are they?
The keys to the vaults were not where the robbers expected them to be.
Get down. Now, do you know where they are? They're over there, the desk, top drawer. Good boy, Grandad.
We've got 5 minutes and then we're off, all right? Stay where you are. Don't even breathe for 15 minutes. If you try anything, you'll die. There'll be somebody outside, and he's a bloody nutter.
More than £6 million, 5 tons of untraceable used banknotes, was stolen from the vaults. The money, much of it from the Ideal Home exhibition, had been stored over the weekend at Security Express's East London depot, nicknamed Fort Knox. It was the biggest cash robbery of all time.
We immediately set up an incident room comprising officers from all 4 areas of the flying squad from London, and this comprised of about 150 officers in all.
It seemed as though it was a clean-cut job, and apart from the actual petrol brought in the guard, obviously a professional team of robbers. At the end of 2 days, we had no forensic evidence had been discovered, and they'd obviously been very clever.
Well, it was quite apparent that there was an insider from Security Express, because the robbers mentioned to the security guards their cars, their registration numbers, their families' names, and with one guard they even mentioned his pet dog.
And 250, and 250, and again 250, and 250, and 250.
The haul was split into 3 and was counted out by the gang at various locations.
250, 250, and again 250, and 250, and 250. Anyway, guys, I'm going to need a rest here. We're going to need some more suitcases. This is the last one, and we've got 6 more bags to empty. We better go and buy some more. We're going to need it.
For 8 months, the flying squad carried out a series of major surveillance operations on known armed robbers and their haunts. Within days of the robbery, the team covering East London received more than 360 tip-offs from all over the country. All had to be followed up, including one which claimed that those responsible for the biggest cash robbery of all time met regularly at the Albion pub in Dalston. Three men in particular interested the surveillance team. They were John Horsley, Billy Hickson and Terry Perkins. In January 1984, detectives investigating the £26 million Brinks-Mat robbery, carried out the previous November, arrested John Horsley after a van used in the job was found near his home. Horsley was cleared of any connection to Brinks-Mat, But the Security Express team decided it was time to question him about his association with Billy Hickson and Terry Perkins.
Let's start at the beginning. To refresh your memory, that was Easter Monday last year.
First of all, he was, you know, very quiet about it, but when he realised that we'd been watching him for several months and the people that he was frequenting, and he obviously then realised it was up. So he actually admitted that he handled a vast amount of the stolen money because a hired vehicle came to his address where Hickson and Perkins were present, and another elder man, which we later identified as John Knight, and offloaded about 14 sacks containing money into his garage in Waltham Abbey.
What about Hickson? You two go back a long way. I stored some money for him as well. At my father-in-law's house up in Ninefields. Ninefields? Yeah, up near Waltham Abbey. He came to me in September and asked me to do him a favour. He might still be there.
The officers went along to the father-in-law's flat and they uncovered £279,000 in a false panel. And from the back of the false panel, later on, we were able to see how much had been there, because every time money was removed on behalf of Hickson, Horsley marked it up. And at the end of the day, when you counted it up and added it to 279,000, you reached a total of nearly 400,000.
But the detectives' hopes of turning Horsley into a supergrass were dashed. Within hours of his arrest, his family was approached by someone who suggested that it would be in Horsley's best interests to say nothing else about the robbery. The following morning, Horsley terminated the interview and was charged with handling proceeds from the robbery. But John Horsley had said enough to incriminate John Knight, who owned a garage in Southgate, Billy Hickson and Terence Perkins, and the flying squad obtained access to their bank and building society accounts.
Although this inquiry actually started off as an armed robbery, as it went on, it became more like a fraud inquiry with the financial evidence that we were looking into.
It was evidence like this which detectives found when they visited John Knight's home on the 22nd of January 1984.
The main thing we found was a long list of building societies, various branches throughout North London, showing the amounts that he had obviously deposited in there. He was in fact making deposits of about £10,000 on each visit to the building societies. And in fact, I recall that one cashier told us that when he handed in £10,000, after she had counted it, she found that there was £100 over. She explained it to him, and he just pushed it back and said, "You better have that as a tip."
There you go. Only another million for.
So kind.
So much money was involved that the gang had hired vans to move it around. Police checked every single van hire agreement for April 1983.
Whoa! Hold that order, it might be time for champagne. Look. A white van hired to M&M garages.
We were aware through Horsley of a white hire van being at the scene, dropping some monies and then collecting some. Two officers travelled around North London, making inquiries of all hiring agencies, and they came up with this white van, which had been hired on the 6th of April. It had been hired by M&M Garage and signed for by Alan Opiola.
Police knew John Knight was a part owner of the M&M garage with Alan Opiola. Opiola was brought in for questioning. He was shocked to discover that the flying squad knew he'd hired a white van, and that they also knew it had been used to transfer some of the stolen money.
What's going to happen now?
That, Alan, is largely up to you. What I know is that you're a key suspect in a £6 million robbery.
And if you go down for that, you won't see North London again until the end of the century. Think of your wife. Think of your family. How are they going to cope?
That night, Opiola agreed to become a supergrass. The following day, his wife Linda did likewise.
Anyway, so about 2 days after the robbery, Terence Perkins and John Knight came to the garage, asked me if I'd hire a van for them. Then they asked me if they could use the house to count the money. You ever seen what 2 million quid looks like? Huh?
When Linda and Alan Opiola decided to give Queen's evidence, we placed Linda Opiola together with her mother-in-law and her young daughter in a secure premises. And at that time we had a 24-hour armed guard on her. We felt this was important at that time because the threat against Linda and her family was quite real.
Threatening calls were made by Jimmy Knight, one of John Knight's brothers, to Linda Opiola. He warned her and her husband not to talk to the police.
When we went to James Knight's place, it's quite a large building in 22 acres. The property was searched and nearly enough £20,000 was recovered.
Jimmy Knight was also charged with the robbery, but the flying squad was convinced that at least 6 others were involved. The question was, who were they? The answer lay behind the walls of Jimmy Knight's scrapyard in East London.
Ian Malone, he was attached to the drug squad, after hearing who we'd arrested, informed us that he actually turned the place over on a search warrant, James Knight's scrapyard in Dalston. This was some 3 weeks prior to the robbery. Present was 6 men: James Knight, John Knight, Terence Perkins, Billy Hickson. And he also mentioned that 2 other men, Ronnie Everett and John Mason, were also present.
Flying squad detectives arrested Mason and Everett, and their bank and building society accounts were closely examined. But there was no evidence to link them to the robbery, and they were released. A few weeks later, both men had left England for a new life abroad. But they weren't alone. Within 24 hours of John Knight's arrest, 2 other men had already fled to Spain. They were another Knight brother, Ronnie, and the former Cray twins henchman, Freddie Foreman. Another man, known to the police, was already there, Clifford Sachs, a London publican who'd moved to Fuengirola in December 1983, having sold his pub, The Fox, in Hackney, shortly after the Security Express robbery. The first Security Express trial ended on the 7th of June 1985. John Knight was sentenced to 22 years for robbery, while Jimmy Knight got 8 years after being found guilty of handling some of the stolen money. Billy Hickson got 6 years also for handling. Terence Perkins pleaded not guilty to robbery, but was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 22 years. John Horsley admitted robbery and got 8 years. Alan Opiola, the prosecution's chief witness, admitted handling some of the money and received a 3.5-year prison sentence. After the break, the Spanish connection, suspects on the run, and how justice caught up with them. With the first trial over, detectives switched their attention to the group of London villains who'd moved to Spain in the preceding months.
Officers from the inquiry went to Spain in June of 1984 to make inquiries about John Knight and properties that he was purchasing over there. And they became aware of other people from London who had suddenly arrived in the Costa del Sol the previous year and had started spending large amounts of money and purchasing properties.
John Mason and Ronnie Everett had already been questioned about their role in the robbery. They'd been released on police bail, but decided to flee to Spain, where they bought a number of luxury apartments in this exclusive block in Marbella. In 1984, the flying squad discovered that they shared a safety deposit box at this Spanish bank.
We went to a local magistrate's court to apply for a search warrant. It took us several hours. When we got back to the bank and opened up the boxes, they were completely empty. We were absolutely gutted. But when we established from the bank records, we discovered that Everett and Mason had been in the interim period and obviously emptied it.
Freddie Foreman was the third suspect police wanted to question about the robbery after he also bought property in this block in Spain. At the time of the Security Express job, he and his wife Maureen's joint account contained just £72.69. They also couldn't afford the rent on their flat in Bermondsey.
By April of 1983, he was receiving assistance from the local council to pay for his council flat. He was having difficulties there financially. His bank account wasn't all that clever. And then all of a sudden, by June, he was spending £76,000 buying a nice house in Marbella. And then by August, he'd spent another £100,000 buying 3 flats in the same luxury complex. So the money had to come from somewhere.
Following the robbery, Foreman made a series of cash deposits at the Allied Irish Bank in Lewisham. In May, he deposited £20,000. The following month, £114,500 went into his account, and in July, he deposited just under £250,000. By November 1983, £363,280 had been deposited in the account. Later that year, he invested much of the money in this bar in the hills above Marbella. Clifford Sachs was another robbery suspect police were keen to question. Like the others, the former pub landlord had bought property in Spain shortly after the robbery. He paid cash for 2 villas next door to each other. One he lived in with his wife Vera, the other he rented out.
He in fact was the licensee of the Fox public house, and soon after the robbery he in fact started to go into the process of selling it, and we discovered that he was in fact buying villas in Spain which came to a total of over £100,000. And when we made our inquiries at the public house about the sale, we discovered that he probably only got about £10,000 for it. So there was an enormous difference from what he was selling the pub for and what he was buying the villas in Spain for.
Detectives had discovered the name of Sachs's business partner in the Fox pub, John Knight. By the end of 1984, a fourth Londoner had entered the frame, Ronnie Knight, best known as the flamboyant owner of nightclubs and the husband of Carry-On star Barbara Windsor. He'd fled to the Costa del Sol with his new girlfriend, Sue Haylock, just hours after his older brother John had been arrested.
Ronnie and his brother John had always had Costa del Sol connections. In fact, the house that he lived in was a property that he'd bought together, first of all, with his brother and then with Barbara Windsor. As regards the others, well, back in 1983-84, there was still no extradition treaty between Britain and Spain. That didn't come in until 1986.
By the end of 1984, detectives were convinced that Ronnie Knight had almost certainly been involved in the Security Express job. His bank records revealed that in the days following the robbery, he'd deposited £34,000 in cash. In July 1983, £222,000 went into his bank accounts. Between October and December, he deposited a further £46,813. By the following January, when he fled to Spain, nearly £315,000 had gone into his account. Years later, Knight would claim in his book Black Knight that the money had come from selling businesses in London. Detectives were able to destroy that defence.
He put forward a story of receiving £80,000 as his share of a pornographic outfit in the West End, which he gave to his accountant in 1983. The man he named, we were in a position to prove that that man had died 2 years previously, so couldn't possibly have given him the money.
With the lack of a formal extradition agreement between Britain and Spain, Mason, Everett, Sachs, Foreman and Knight were beyond the reach of British justice. But by 1985, the Spaniards were coming under increasing pressure to expel the fugitives and force them to return to Britain. Ronnie Knight and Sue Haylock got on with their lives, and in a grand cliff-top setting, the couple celebrated their marriage in 1986. The wedding guests included Clifford Sachs, Ronnie Everett, John Mason and Freddie Foreman. But the celebrations weren't to last. In July 1989, the Spanish acted.
Freddie Foreman was arrested leaving a certain lady's flat in Marbella and put in a police car. He thought he was going to the police station where they took him to, and then he would probably be released. In fact, it wasn't until he was actually driven onto the tarmac at Malaga Airport that he realised what was going to happen. It took about, I think it was 7 Spanish police officers to get him on the plane.
The first we knew of it was when he landed at Heathrow Airport. We had a warrant and he was arrested.
In April 1990, Foreman was jailed for 9 years for handling proceeds of the Security Express robbery. The Old Bailey jury had found him not guilty of taking part in the robbery. Ronnie Knight was becoming more and more isolated in Spain.
I think that he became past his sell-by date in terms of a lot of the younger villains anyway that came down here. The Costa del Sol, whether you are or whether you're not a villain, is a very small world, particularly for someone who can't go home. It's okay, if you're a retired expat, it's a gilded cage. If you're a villain who can't go home, it's just an open prison in the sun.
The crime scene in the south of Spain was changing fast. The new breed of criminal, mainly big-time drug dealers, despised the likes of Ronnie Knight, who still basked under the media spotlight and lived up to his nickname, the Celebrity.
What's happened is a lot of the villains that come here now have not come here because they're running away from anything. They've come here because they're here to do business. They have a different set of rules, a different way of doing things. They're not frightened of using violence. They have a different code of conduct, so even if you happen to have done a big blag and are a big name, you don't mean anything to them, and they react accordingly. He became, let's say to a certain extent, a spent force in the eyes of a lot of the people that are here. So come 1994, when someone in his position has not got the respect they used to command, then really it's time to move on.
On the 2nd of May last year, Ronnie Knight said goodbye to his wife and to Spain and boarded a plane to Luton Airport, laid on by Sky Television.
We received a phone call about just after 2 in the afternoon to say that he'd be landing at Luton Airport about 3:30. So we had to get together, tea, get changed and meet and get up to the airport to meet him.
Sunshine.
It was a bit of a rush.
It's been a long time, hasn't it?
In the past, most people read, when they read about Ronnie Knight, have always been told how well he likes to be presented. Silk shirts, silk tie, smart suits and shoes, etc. And bearing in mind that he'd actually come over here to give himself up, so he would be here quite some time, he was carrying a holdall with 4 pairs of shoes in it and a razor, and that was it.
Get away, Ronnie!
On the 3rd of January this year, Knight stood trial at the Old Bailey charged with robbery. For over 10 years, he professed his innocence and claimed that, like his brothers John and Jimmy, he'd been set up by the police. But the following day, he changed his mind and pleaded guilty to handling. He was jailed for 7 years. 12 years after the Security Express robbery, the police investigation continues.
We still have the warrants outstanding for those currently staying in Spain or remaining in Spain. They will always be in existence. There's sufficient evidence, we believe, to convict any one of them should they come back.
Today, Sue Haylock lives alone on the Costa del Sol. Security Express has started legal proceedings to gain ownership of the Villa Limonar. She now scrapes a living by running the kitchen at Wynn's Bar near where she lives. She declined to be interviewed. Clifford Sachs is also still living on the Costa del Sol. His wife died 2 years ago, and nowadays he spends most of his time drinking in the local bars. He has no intention of ever returning to London.
Do you have any plans to return to England?
No, still no. I'm happy here. The only one they got to get me is to get my bones over there. So.
Ronnie Everett still lives in this block of luxury flats in the centre of Marbella, while Mason has moved a few miles away to this exclusive estate along the coast. They're rarely seen in public, and this is the first time either has been filmed. Every Saturday, John Mason meets up with Ronnie Everett for lunch at a nearby restaurant.
Mr. Mason? Mr. Mason? Mr. Mason, there's a warrant out for your arrest. Do you have any intention of coming back to England? Mr. Mason?
Mason was reluctant to talk about the robbery or to explain how he makes a living today. Freddie Foreman served fewer than 4 of the 9 years of his sentence before being released. He was seen in public earlier this year as a pallbearer at Ronnie Cray's funeral. He's since been spotted on the Costa del Sol. Jimmy Knight, too, has been released from prison and has returned to live in the Algarve. Alan and Linda Opiola were placed on a witness protection program by the police and given new identities. An underworld contract on their lives still exists. Ronnie Knight gets on with his jail sentence. At Parkhurst, his vegetable garden won him an award. Recently, he was transferred to a lower security prison. He's 61 years old and broke. He'll be eligible for release in 1997. 2 of the £6 million stolen in the Security Express robbery has never been recovered.
What's happened to all the money?
Drawballs out there.
We should point out that Security Express radically changed security procedures in the wake of the robbery.
In conclusion, the Securities Express robbery, orchestrated by John Knight and his accomplices, remains one of the most audacious and meticulously planned heists in British criminal history. It underscores the fine line between genius and criminality, revealing how ambition and the quest for the perfect crime can lead to one's downfall. The saga of the Knight brothers, from their humble beginnings in Dalston to becoming central figures in one of the country's most talked about crimes, encapsulates the broader narrative about family, loyalty, and the consequences of a life led on the wrong side of the law. The involvement of informants or supergressors in cracking these cases highlight the complexities of criminal investigations and the ethical dilemmas faced by law enforcement in their pursuit of justice. The aftermath of the robbery and the subsequent trials and convictions reveal the intricate dance between criminals and the police, a dance that often involves betrayal, fear, and the hope of redemption. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter of crime and punishment, it invites us to ponder several questions about the nature of criminality, justice, and society's response to both. What drives individuals to pursue a path of high-stake crime, knowing the potential consequences of their actions? How do personal relationships and loyalties within the criminal networks influence the dynamic of criminal enterprises and their eventual unraveling? In what ways do stories like that of the Security Express robbery challenge our perceptions of criminals as mere lawbreakers, revealing instead the complex human stories behind the headlines? The role of supergressors in solving crimes is controversial and fraught with ethical considerations. Is their use a necessary tool in the fight against organised crime, or does it undermine the principles of justice and a fair trial? The Knight brothers' story is also one of social and economic context. How do societal conditions and opportunities, or the lack thereof, contribute to the choices that lead individuals down the path of crime? These questions invite us to engage in a deeper conversation about the factors that lead individuals to commit acts of crime, and the ways in which society responds to these acts. The Security Express robbery, with its dramatic execution and equally dramatic aftermath, serves as a catalyst for these discussions, challenging us to look beyond the crime itself and consider the broader implications for justice, morality, and human behaviour.